February 9, 1946. Yokohama Harbor, Japan. ****. The winter wind cuts across the ruins like a blade forged in silence. A young woman, her kimono patched with scraps of military canvas, crouches beside what was once the entrance to her family's textile shop. The building is gone, reduced to skeletal beams and ash by the firebombing raids of 1945. In her hands, she holds a tin cup, dented and blackened, the only possession she carried through the inferno that consumed her city. Around her, thousands move through the rubble like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes fixed on nothing. The harbor beyond is choked with the wreckage of war, sunken freighters listing in the shallows, cranes bent and useless, the water itself coated with a film of oil that shimmers in the weak morning light. The air smells of smoke and salt and something else, something bitter and final, the scent of a world that has ended. Then, across the broken waterfront, a sound rises that does not belong to this landscape of devastation. It is the low rumble of diesel engines, the grinding of heavy treads on stone. American trucks, painted olive drab, roll through the shattered streets in a convoy that seems impossibly clean, impossibly whole. Behind them come more vehicles, jeeps, supply wagons, canvas-covered transports stacked with crates bearing English words the starving cannot read. The woman with the tin cup does not move. She has learned not to hope. Hope is a luxury more dangerous than hunger. But then the trucks stop. Soldiers dismount, not with rifles raised, not with the swagger of conquerors, but with something in their hands that catches the light. Steam rises from the containers they carry, white and pure against the gray sky. An officer, his face young and sunburned, approaches the crowd. He does not shout. He does not command. He simply gestures, and the Japanese civilians, those who have survived the fire and the starvation and the collapse of everything they were told was eternal, begin to move forward. Slowly, cautiously, like animals who have forgotten what kindness looks like. The woman watches as the first person in line, a man so thin his shoulders are nothing but bone beneath his torn shirt, receives a ladle of soup poured into his cupped hands. He drinks, and then, incomprehensibly, impossibly, he begins to weep. To understand this moment, to grasp why the arrival of American food and blankets in post-war Japan became a rupture in the very fabric of how millions of people understood the world, we must first return to the architecture of belief that governed the Japanese home front throughout the Pacific War. For 4 years, the civilian population had been fed a diet not merely of rationed rice and pickled vegetables, but of propaganda so pervasive, so totalizing, that it became indistinguishable from reality itself. The imperial government, through its control of every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lesson, had constructed a narrative in which the enemy was not simply a military adversary but a civilizational threat, barbaric, bestial, fundamentally inhuman. The Americans, Japanese civilians were told, were devils in human form. Government pamphlets distributed through neighborhood associations depicted American soldiers with exaggerated features, fanged mouths, claw-like hands, eyes that glowed with sadistic pleasure. Schoolchildren were taught that if Japan lost the war, American troops would rape every woman, murder every man, enslave every child. The message was reinforced through every available channel. Radio programs featuring actors screaming in simulated agony as American voices laughed in the background, posters showing blonde-haired soldiers bayoneting infants, testimonies from alleged witnesses in occupied territories describing atrocities so horrific they seemed designed not to inform but to paralyze with terror. This was not accidental. The Japanese military leadership understood, as the war turned against them, that the home front must be conditioned for a final, apocalyptic resistance. In the summer of 1945, as American forces prepared for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, the government distributed sharpened bamboo spears to civilians and instructed them in suicide tactics. Women were taught how to strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves beneath American tanks. The phrase Gyokusai, shattered jewel, meaning death with honor rather than surrender, became the official policy not just for soldiers but for the entire nation. In Okinawa, where the only major land battle on Japanese territory had been fought, civilians had leaped from cliffs by the hundreds, mothers clutching their children, rather than face capture by the Americans they believed would torture them. By February 1946, when the woman with the tin cup stood in the ruins of Yokohama, the war had been over for 5 months. Japan had surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice, announcing that the nation must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. But surrender, for the civilian population, did not mean relief. It meant the arrival of the nightmare they had been promised. As American occupation forces began landing in late August and early September 1945, millions of Japanese civilians prepared for the worst. Women fled to the countryside, hiding in mountain villages or remote farms. Those who remained in the cities locked themselves inside whatever structures still stood, barricading doors, clutching kitchen knives, waiting for the screams to begin. But the screams did not come. What happened instead, or rather, what failed to happen, created a cognitive rupture so profound that its effects would ripple through Japanese society for decades. The American soldiers who disembarked at Yokohama and Tokyo and Osaka did not rampage through the streets. They did not drag women from their homes. They did not bayonet children or burn villages. Instead, they distributed food. They established medical clinics. They handed out blankets and milk powder and canned meat. They smiled. They offered cigarettes to old men. They played baseball in cleared lots and invited Japanese boys to join them. And this fundamental contradiction between expectation and reality shattered something essential in the psychological architecture of those who witnessed it. The woman in Yokohama, the one with the tin cup, was named Takahashi Fumiko. She was 23 years old. Before the war, her family had owned a small but prosperous textile business, supplying kimono fabric to shops throughout the Kanto region. Her father had been a traditionalist, a believer in the Bushido virtues of loyalty and self-sacrifice, a man who hung a portrait of the emperor in their home's alcove and bowed to it each morning. When the war began, he contributed metal from the family workshop to the government's collection drives. When Fumiko's younger brother was conscripted in 1944, her father had seen him off with sake and ceremony, telling him it was an honor to die for the emperor. The brother died in the Philippines, though the family did not learn this until after the surrender. The telegram arrived in September 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's capitulation, delivered by a gaunt postal worker who apologized for the delay. The entire communications infrastructure had collapsed. Fumiko's father read the telegram once, folded it carefully, and walked to the alcove where the emperor's portrait hung. He removed the portrait. He carried it to the small garden behind their shop, laid it on the ground, and urinated on it. Then he went inside and did not speak for 3 days. By February 1946, Fumiko's father was dead, not from injury or illness, but from starvation. He had divided his food rations among Fumiko and her mother, insisting he was not hungry, until finally his body simply ceased. Fumiko's mother survived but had stopped speaking, her mind retreating into some interior place where the world made sense. And Fumiko herself existed in a state of suspension, moving through each day because the alternative was to stop moving, and stopping meant death. On the morning the American trucks arrived, Fumiko had not eaten in 4 days. The government ration system had collapsed entirely. The winter crops had failed. The black market demanded prices no ordinary person could pay. A single cup of rice cost more than a month's pre-war wages, if you could find rice at all. People were eating sawdust mixed with acorn flour. They were boiling grass and calling it soup. Children in the streets had the distended bellies and stick-thin limbs of advanced malnutrition. In Tokyo alone, occupation authorities estimated that over 500 people were dying of starvation every day. When Fumiko joined the line forming in front of the American trucks, she did so without thought, acting on the same dull instinct that had kept her searching through rubble for anything edible, anything that might sustain her mother for one more day. She expected nothing. Or perhaps she expected what she had been taught to expect: cruelty, mockery, the final humiliation before death. Instead, a soldier. He could not have been more than 20 years old, with a sunburned nose and a Midwestern accent she could not understand, ladled soup into her tin cup until it overflowed. The soup was thick, pale yellow, studded with chunks of potato and carrot and something she did not recognize but understood to be meat. Real meat. The steam rose into her face, carrying a smell so rich and complex it seemed impossible, a smell from a world that no longer existed. The soldier said something in English, his voice gentle, then moved to the next person in line. Fumiko stood there, holding the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep through the metal into her frozen fingers. And then, to her own shock and shame, she began to cry. This reaction, this involuntary, overwhelming emotional response, was repeated thousands of times across Japan in the winter and spring of 1946. American military records from the occupation period document scene after scene of Japanese civilians weeping openly as they received food distributions, medical care, or simple acts of human decency from the soldiers they had been taught to fear as demons. A Marine Corps lieutenant named Robert Sherrod, assigned to document the occupation for military archives, wrote in his journal about visiting a distribution center in Osaka where a line of women, some with infants strapped to their backs, waited for powdered milk. When the first woman reached the table and received her allotment, a 5-pound bag of Klim, the military's dried milk formula, she pressed the bag to her chest and sobbed so violently that medics had to help her to a bench to recover. "I have seen men cry on battlefields," Sherrod wrote, "but I was not prepared for this. These are not tears of gratitude, exactly. They are something else, something deeper and more terrible. It is as if the act of receiving kindness from us breaks something inside them, some structure of belief they built to survive what they were told was coming." What Sherrod observed, what he struggled to articulate, was the collapse of a totalizing ideological framework under the weight of empirical reality. The Japanese civilians who wept as they received American soup were not simply relieved or grateful, though they were both of those things. They were experiencing a kind of cognitive vertigo, a sudden and irreconcilable contradiction between the world as they had been taught it must be and the world as it actually was. For 4 years, every institution they trusted, their government, their military, their schools, their religious leaders, had told them the same thing. The Americans are monsters, and surrender means annihilation. And now here were those same Americans, handing them food, wrapping their children in woolen blankets, treating their sick. The implications were staggering. If the Americans were not demons, then what else had been a lie? If the enemy showed mercy, what did that mean about the war Japan had fought? About the sacrifices demanded in the emperor's name? About the deaths of sons and brothers and fathers who had been told they were defending civilization itself? The American military, for its part, had not arrived in Japan with any particular humanitarian agenda. The occupation's primary goals were strategic: demilitarization, democratization, and the prevention of Japan's re-emergence as a military threat. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, governed Japan with the authority of an emperor himself, wielding more absolute power than any foreign leader in Japanese history. His directives reshaped every aspect of Japanese society: disbanding the military, purging government officials, rewriting the constitution, redistributing land, reforming education. But MacArthur and his staff also understood something fundamental. A starving population is a breeding ground for extremism. The United States had watched as economic devastation and food scarcity in post-World War I Germany had contributed to the rise of Nazism. They would not repeat that mistake. In the fall of 1945, as occupation forces assessed conditions in Japan, they found a nation on the brink of famine. The wartime government had requisitioned so much food for the military that civilian stocks were depleted. The transportation infrastructure, railways, roads, ports, lay in ruins, preventing what little food existed in rural areas from reaching the cities. The fishing fleet, once a primary source of protein, had been destroyed by naval warfare and aerial bombardment. Urban populations, swollen by refugees from the countryside and repatriated soldiers and civilians from former colonies, faced a caloric intake far below subsistence level. In response, the United States initiated one of the largest humanitarian relief operations in history. Beginning in late 1945 and expanding throughout 1946, American ships transported thousands of tons of food to Japan every week. Wheat, rice, canned goods, powdered milk, sugar, cooking oil. The U.S. military, which had spent 4 years perfecting the logistics of projecting force across the Pacific, now deployed those same systems to feed the population it had recently been bombing. By the end of 1946, American food aid was providing approximately 1/3 of all calories consumed in urban Japan. Without it, occupation authorities estimated, between 3 and 5 million Japanese civilians would have died of starvation. This was not charity in the sentimental sense. It was calculated policy, designed to stabilize Japan and prevent the chaos that might invite Soviet influence. But to the Japanese civilians receiving it, to people like Fumiko, standing in the ruins of Yokohama with a cup of American soup warming her hands, the calculations did not matter. What mattered was the soup itself, the thickness of it, the chunks of potato, the impossible presence of meat, the fact that it was given freely, without cruelty, without humiliation, by the soldiers in olive drab who were supposed to be demons. The soup became a symbol, not in the abstract sense, but in the most concrete way possible. It appeared in letters and diaries and later in memoirs, always described in minute sensory detail. The color of it, the smell, the warmth, the taste of salt and fat and sustenance. For a population that had spent years eating bark and grass and sawdust, that had watched children starve and parents waste away, the soup represented something that could not quite be put into words but was nonetheless understood. The existence of a world where such abundance was possible, where food could be given rather than hoarded, where the enemy did not have to be exterminated but could be fed. Fumiko carried her cup of soup back through the rubble to the shelter where her mother sat wrapped in rags, staring at nothing. She knelt beside her and held the cup to her mother's lips. The older woman drank mechanically, without recognition, but she drank. And Fumiko, watching her mother swallow the American soup, felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, exactly, but a small, painful reopening of the possibility that the world might contain something other than suffering. Over the following weeks, Fumiko returned to the distribution center every time the American trucks arrived. Each time, she received her ration: soup, canned meat, condensed milk, sometimes a woolen blanket or a bar of soap. Each time, she observed the soldiers who distributed these things. They were not monsters. They were boys, country boys, many of them, from places called Iowa and Nebraska and Georgia, places Fumiko had never heard of. They chewed gum. They smoked cigarettes. They showed each other photographs of girlfriends and wives and children. They were, in every observable way, human. This ordinariness was, in its way, more radical than any ideology. It undermined the entire edifice of racial and civilizational superiority upon which the Pacific War had been justified. The Japanese government had taught its citizens that they were a divine race, chosen by the gods, fundamentally different from and superior to all other peoples. The Americans, in this worldview, were not merely a different nation but a different category of being. materialistic, spiritually empty, racially mongrel, incapable of honor or sacrifice. Yet here were these Americans, these supposedly inferior beings, displaying precisely the virtues, generosity, discipline, mercy, that Japanese propaganda had claimed were uniquely Japanese. By the spring of 1946, something unprecedented was occurring in the ruins of Japan's cities. Spontaneous expressions of gratitude and even affection toward the occupying forces. Children began following American soldiers through the streets, calling out, "Haro! Haro!" their phonetic approximation of "hello." Women sewed small cloth dolls and left them at distribution centers as gifts. Men who spoke a little English approached soldiers to practice conversation, to ask about America, to try to understand this place that could produce such plenty. The American military brass were, in many cases, unprepared for this response. They had expected resentment, resistance, perhaps guerrilla warfare. Instead, they encountered something like relief, or perhaps something more complex than relief. Gratitude mixed with shame. Wonder mixed with grief. The psychological phenomenon was significant enough that military psychiatrists and sociologists were dispatched to study it. One report, filed by a Navy psychologist named Dr. Harold Strauss in March 1946, attempted to analyze what he called the affective dissonance observed in Japanese civilian interactions with occupation personnel. The subjects display symptoms consistent with ideological disillusionment, Strauss wrote. Having been prepared for annihilation, they instead encounter benevolence. This creates a state of cognitive restructuring in which previously held beliefs about self, nation, and enemy must be radically revised. The emotional expressions observed, weeping, effusive gratitude, repeated expressions of shame, suggest not merely relief but a kind of psychological rebirth. They are, quite literally, relearning how to understand the world. Fumiko experienced this relearning in fragments, in small moments that accumulated into something transformative. There was the day a young American medic treated her mother's infected leg wound, cleaning and bandaging it with a gentleness that made Fumiko remember her brother, the one who had died in the Philippines. There was the afternoon when a distribution center ran out of soup before everyone in line had been served, and the American officer in charge apologized, and promised to bring more the next day. There was the morning when Fumiko found a chocolate bar, American military issue, left on the step of her shelter with a note in awkward Japanese characters. For children. Please share. These small acts of decency, multiplied across thousands of interactions every day, began to erode the foundation of the narrative that had sustained Japanese wartime ideology. If the Americans were capable of kindness, then perhaps the entire structure of belief that had led Japan into war was suspect. If the enemy showed mercy, then perhaps the war itself had been something other than the holy crusade the government had claimed. The broader implications of this recognition extended far beyond individual gratitude. In April 1946, Japan held its first democratic elections under the new constitution drafted by MacArthur's staff. Women voted for the first time in Japanese history. 39 women were elected to the Diet, Japan's parliament, a number that would not be matched again for decades. The election was, in many ways, a referendum not just on political parties but on the entire concept of authority. The military leaders who had promised divine victory were gone, purged or imprisoned or awaiting trial as war criminals. The emperor, once proclaimed a living god, had renounced his divinity in a radio address on New Year's Day 1946, declaring himself to be merely human. Into this vacuum stepped the Americans, who were understood not as conquerors in the traditional sense but as something stranger and more unsettling. Liberators who did not claim dominion, occupiers who distributed food rather than extracting tribute. This paradox, of power exercised through generosity rather than violence, became the defining experience of the occupation for millions of Japanese civilians. Fumiko, in her small way, participated in this transformation. In May 1946, she found work at a distribution center, helping to organize food deliveries and serving as a translator between American personnel and Japanese civilians. The work provided a small salary and daily meals, both of which she used to support her mother and to help neighbors in their bombed-out neighborhood. But more than the material benefits, the work gave her a sense of purpose that had been absent since the war's end. She was no longer simply surviving. She was rebuilding. One day in June, as she helped unload crates of canned peaches from an American truck, Fumiko overheard two soldiers talking. One of them, a sergeant from Ohio, was complaining about the duty assignment. "I didn't sign up to be a delivery boy," he said. "I joined the Marines to fight, not to hand out groceries to people who were trying to kill us a year ago." The other soldier, older and quieter, was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe this is how you actually win a war, not by killing the enemy, but by making them not want to be your enemy anymore." Fumiko did not know if the sergeant understood what his companion was saying. She herself was still learning to understand it. But the words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she went about her work, as she ladled soup into the cups of hollow-eyed strangers, as she watched American soldiers distribute blankets to shivering children. This was not the world she had been taught to expect, but it was, undeniably, the world that existed. And somehow, impossibly, it contained space for her to continue living. The symbolism of food, and particularly of American abundance, became a recurring motif in Japanese accounts of the occupation period. Memoirs and oral histories collected in later decades return again and again to specific items. The chocolate bars that tasted like nothing Japanese children had ever imagined, the canned Spam that seemed miraculous in its preservation, the powdered milk that could be mixed with water to create something approximating nourishment. These were not merely calories. They were artifacts from a different civilization, one that operated according to rules that seemed, to Japanese civilians emerging from starvation, almost supernatural in their generosity. Consider the mathematics of it. In 1945, Japan's per capita caloric intake had fallen to approximately 1,450 calories per day, well below the level needed to sustain an adult. In rural areas, where some food could still be grown or foraged, the situation was marginally better. But in the cities, people were dying in the streets. By contrast, American soldiers in the occupation force were allocated 4,000 calories per day, nearly 3 times what the average Japanese civilian consumed. The surplus from American mess halls alone, the food that soldiers did not finish, that would have been thrown away, represented more calories than many Japanese families saw in a week. This disparity was not lost on Japanese observers. It raised uncomfortable questions. How could a nation defeated in war possess such abundance? How could the enemy, supposedly decadent and weak, produce enough food to feed not only its own massive military but also the civilian population of the country it had conquered? What did this say about the relative strength and vitality of the two civilizations? The official Japanese wartime narrative had insisted that American materialism was a sign of spiritual weakness, that Japan's superior moral character would triumph over Western greed and excess. But now that narrative lay in ruins alongside the bombed-out cities. The Americans had not only won the war, they had won so decisively that they could afford to be generous. Their abundance was not weakness. It was power of a kind Japan had never imagined. Fumiko began to learn English. One of the American officers at the distribution center, a captain named Morrison from Pennsylvania, offered informal lessons to Japanese staff members who were interested. Fumiko attended every session, memorizing vocabulary, struggling with pronunciation, slowly building the capacity to communicate directly rather than through the limited pidgin that had developed between occupiers and occupied. Through these lessons, she learned things that astonished her. Captain Morrison described his family's farm, a property of 160 acres that produced corn and wheat and dairy cattle. Fumiko tried to imagine this, a single family owning so much land, producing so much food that they sold the surplus to cities. Morrison showed her a photograph of his home, a white farmhouse with a porch and painted shutters and an automobile parked in front. The house looked impossibly large, impossibly prosperous. "Do you live there alone?" Fumiko asked, assuming it must be some kind of communal building. Morrison laughed. "No, my parents live there. And my younger sister. 3 people. 3 people in a house that size, with that much land, with an automobile." Fumiko thought of her family's textile shop, which had seemed prosperous before the war, but which could have fit inside Morrison's farmhouse twice over. She thought of the shelter where she and her mother now lived, a space barely large enough to lie down in, with walls made of scavenged wood and a roof of salvaged tin. "Is your family rich?" she asked. Morrison seemed confused by the question. "No, we're just regular farmers. Middle class, I guess. Most families where I come from live about the same way." Most families. Fumiko struggled to process this. If most American families lived with such abundance, then what did that mean about the society that produced them? What did it mean about the distribution of resources, the organization of labor, the relationship between citizens and state? These were not questions she had language for yet, but they pressed against her understanding, forcing her to reconsider assumptions she had never known she held. The winter of 1946 gave way to spring, and spring to summer. American food aid continued, and gradually, slowly, the worst edge of starvation receded. Markets began to reopen, though prices remained high. Farmers brought produce into the cities again, now that roads were being repaired and trains were running. The occupation government instituted land reforms, breaking up the huge estates that had been owned by aristocratic families and redistributing the property to tenant farmers. The economic rationale was to create a stable class of independent smallholders, but the psychological impact was perhaps more significant. It demonstrated that the old order, the hierarchies that had seemed eternal and divinely ordained, could be dissolved and remade. Fumiko's mother, who had been nearly catatonic through the winter, began to speak again. Not much, and not about anything important. Just small observations about the weather, requests for tea, comments on neighbors. But it was speech, which meant the return of some part of her humanity. Fumiko took this as a sign. Not of recovery, exactly. There would be no returning to what had been lost. But of continuation. Of the possibility that life might contain something beyond mere survival. In August 1946, on the first anniversary of Japan's surrender, Fumiko attended a memorial service at a neighborhood temple. The building itself was damaged, its roof collapsed, but the space was sacred nonetheless. People gathered to remember the dead, the soldiers who would not return, the civilians killed in the bombings, the children who had starved. An old priest led the service, chanting sutras in a voice roughened by age and smoke damage. But afterward, he added words that were not part of the traditional liturgy. "We were told that surrender meant the end of everything," he said. "We were told the enemy would destroy us, that to live under occupation would be a fate worse than death. But we are here. We are alive. And the enemy has fed us. I do not understand this. I do not know what it means about the war we fought, about the sacrifices we made, about the world we thought we knew. But I know this, we are alive. And that is not nothing." The congregation sat in silence. Some wept. Fumiko did not weep, she had done enough weeping. But she felt something settle in her chest, some weight she had been carrying without knowing it. The priest was right. They were alive. Against every prediction, every preparation, every ideology that had governed their understanding of what surrender would mean, they had survived. And more than survived, they had been fed by the enemy. They had been shown mercy. In September 1946, a photographer from Life magazine visited the distribution center where Fumiko worked. He was documenting the occupation for an American audience, capturing images of a defeated nation being rebuilt. Fumiko watched him move through the crowd of Japanese civilians waiting for their rations, his camera clicking, capturing faces marked by hunger and exhaustion and something else. Something the photographer probably understood as gratitude, but which was more complicated than that. He photographed the American soldiers ladling soup, their faces patient and weary. He photographed Japanese children receiving chocolate bars, their eyes wide with wonder. He photographed an old woman wrapping herself in an American woolen blanket, the fabric still bearing its military label. And then he photographed Fumiko herself, standing beside a crate of canned goods, her hands folded in front of her, her expression serious and direct. "What's your name?" he asked through a translator. "Takahashi Fumiko." "How old are you?" 24. "What do you think about the American soldiers?" Fumiko considered the question. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she would not have known how to answer. Now she said, "They are not what we were told. They are different. They are human." The photographer nodded, scribbling notes. "Do you think the occupation is good for Japan?" This was harder. Fumiko thought about her father, dead of starvation. She thought about her brother, dead in the Philippines. She thought about the city around her, still largely in ruins, still inhabited by ghosts. "I think," she said slowly, "that we were wrong about many things. And maybe this is how we learn to be different." The photograph appeared in Life several weeks later, part of a feature story titled Japan Reborn. The caption beneath Fumiko's image read, "Japanese civilian worker at U.S. Distribution Center, Yokohama. Represents new generation rebuilding from defeat." Fumiko never saw the magazine. It did not circulate in Japan. But the photographer sent her a copy of the image, mailed through military channels. She kept it, folded carefully, among her few possessions. By the end of 1946, the immediate crisis had passed. Starvation, while still a threat, was no longer the mass phenomenon it had been. The occupation government had stabilized food distribution, rebuilt critical infrastructure, and begun the long process of economic recovery. But the psychological transformation, the rupture in ideology and belief, would take far longer to process. For Fumiko and millions like her, the experience of receiving food and aid from the Americans had fundamentally altered their understanding of power, of nationalism, of what it meant to be human in relation to other humans. The government had told them the enemy was inhuman, and the enemy had responded with soup and blankets. This contradiction could not be explained away. It demanded a rethinking of everything. In later years, historians would debate the meaning and legacy of the American occupation of Japan. Some would emphasize the strategic calculations, the Cold War imperatives that shaped policy. Others would focus on the democratic reforms, the Constitution, the dismantling of militarism. But for those who lived through it, for the people who stood in line for soup, who wrapped their children in American blankets, who learned to speak English and to imagine a different kind of society, the occupation was something more personal and more profound. It was an education in the contingency of belief, in the possibility that the world might be other than what you were taught. Fumiko eventually married an American serviceman, a logistics officer she met at the distribution center. They moved to the United States in 1952, settling in California, where she raised 2 children and worked as a translator. She never spoke much about the war, or about the winter of 1946, or about standing in the ruins of Yokohama with a cup of American soup in her hands. The memories were too complex, too weighted with grief and shame and gratitude all tangled together. But sometimes, when her children asked her about Japan, about what it had been like, she would tell them about the soup. The thickness of it. The warmth. The way it had seemed in that moment like a message from another world, a world where abundance was possible, where enemies could become something other than enemies, where the future did not have to be a repetition of the past. "They gave us soup," she would say. "And we cried, because we understood, finally, that we had been lied to about everything." The American blankets distributed during the occupation bore a label, U.S. Army, wool, olive drab. They were standard military issue, nothing special, the same blankets American soldiers used in the field. But to Japanese civilians emerging from the coldest winter in memory, sleeping in ruins and shelters with no heat, these blankets became objects of profound significance. They were heavy. They were warm. They smelled of wool and lanolin and something indefinably American, something clean and industrial. And they were freely given. In the years after the occupation ended, you could still find these blankets in Japanese homes, carefully maintained, often used not for warmth but kept as heirlooms. They represented a specific moment in history, the moment when everything changed, when the enemy became something else, when the narrative that had governed an entire society collapsed under the weight of simple human kindness. The soup and the blankets were symbols, yes, but symbols of a very specific thing, the power of abundance to reshape ideology. Japan had been defeated militarily, its cities destroyed, its military disbanded. But the final, decisive defeat, the one that made genuine transformation possible, came not from bombs or battles but from the simple, overwhelming fact of American generosity. It was impossible to sustain the belief in American barbarism when American soldiers were feeding your children. It was impossible to maintain the fantasy of Japanese superiority when the enemy possessed such surplus that they could give it away without diminishing themselves. This was a kind of power that Japan's wartime leaders had never imagined, because it was a power their own system could never have produced. The militarist state had extracted everything from its people: metal for weapons, rice for soldiers, sons for cannon fodder, until there was nothing left. And then the Americans arrived and demonstrated that a society organized differently, according to different principles, could produce such abundance that it overflowed, that it could be shared even with enemies. The epilogue to this story is written in the Japan that emerged from the occupation, a nation that renounced war in its constitution, that built an economy based on trade rather than conquest, that became one of the most stable democracies in Asia. The transformation was not complete, not perfect, and the scars of war and occupation remained. But the fundamental shift, from a society organized around military expansion and racial superiority to one oriented toward peace and prosperity, was real and enduring. And at the root of that transformation, in the experiences of millions of individuals, were moments like the one Fumiko lived through. Standing in the ruins, receiving soup from the enemy, understanding that everything you had been taught was wrong. Not wrong in some abstract ideological sense, but wrong in the most concrete way possible. Wrong about who the enemy was. Wrong about what surrender would mean. Wrong about the nature of power and civilization and what it meant to be human. The Americans who distributed soup and blankets in the winter of 1946 were not saints. They were soldiers following orders, implementing policy, doing a job. Many of them were uncomfortable with the role, frustrated by the duty of feeding people they had recently been trying to kill. But their discomfort did not matter. What mattered was the act itself, the material reality of food and warmth freely given. That reality could not be denied or explained away. It existed, solid and undeniable, forcing a reckoning with everything that had come before. In the end, this is the larger truth that Fumiko's story illustrates, that abundance is not merely economic but ideological, that the ability to be generous is a form of power more durable than coercion, and that the transformation of enemies into something else, into partners, into fellow humans, requires not just the cessation of violence but the demonstration of an alternative way of being in the world. The Americans brought soup and blankets to occupy Japan, and in doing so, they brought the evidence of a different kind of society, one organized around principles that the Japanese militarist state could not comprehend and therefore could not survive. The woman with the tin cup stood in the ruins and wept, not just because she was hungry and the soup was warm, but because in that moment she understood that the world was larger and stranger and more full of possibility than everything she had been taught. That is the power of a simple act of kindness in the midst of devastation. That is what it means when the enemy offers soup and the people who receive it cry.